When I agreed to do this session, the context is important. I commented that I was looking forward to a session on field notes because mine aren't very good. And then I end up getting roped into it. So I've got a few observations on what I've done to try to improve my practice, and I'll open with some of that. Okay, so yes, some hints and suggestions on making it accessible, and also how I've used fieldwork data in native title reports. So some of this information is actually from some materials I developed for CNTA about 1.5 years ago. So there's a few of the slides that I have taken from there, and I know it's a bit difficult to read, so I might just go over some of the content. So touch on this, what both Petronella and Craig have mentioned is the basic information is your date, who you're speaking to, and where you are. And one of the things, as both have commented on, the exact wording that people use is often one of the key things that I do record. My own notes are often very shorthand notes on what's being said. Part of my practice that I've developed over the years is making sure I buy fieldwork notebooks that have numbered pages. I like a small A5 notebook for carrying around. I find that most useful. And also making sure you're keeping one notebook for one project, be it, or subject. The other thing I've done as my practice has developed is making sure that, particularly for shorter jobs, like if I'm doing heritage work, is not now including my review material in there. So you might be reading previous heritage reports and so on. Previously, I had the fieldwork notes and those review notes in the same book. I've now separated that out. So the fieldwork notes are completely separate, because often the interpretive notes, you might include your thoughts on a matter, and I want to keep that separate from what's actually said in the fieldwork context. Craig, I had the benefit a couple of years ago, of, well, more than a couple, of doing some work with Craig and seeing his magnificent fieldwork notes and indexing, and I try to bring some of that into my own practice as well. One of the things I do that I find really useful is actually, for instance, if you're in a meeting, if it's in a sitting around a table with people, is actually doing a little sketch and writing down who's sitting where. And this is the stuff that can assist you both in making sure you note who actually says something, but reflecting afterwards on what's going on socially with where people choose to sit, who they're sitting with, who they're sitting far away from. And in larger meeting contexts, you'll notice this. Some large meetings, I think it's really useful for the anthropologist to go around and collect the names. So you actually can put names to faces if you don't know people well. You can also reflect on and observe later if you've got very gendered seating practices or family groups sitting together. As both Craig and Petronella have mentioned, these different techniques of recording, reflecting on your fieldwork notes. So the most basic thing I do is come back afterwards with a different coloured pen, review the quick notes, and just note if there's like the question I've asked, because often the information people are giving you are in response to questions you've asked. So it's good to know what actually people are saying in response to what question. So, as I mentioned, my notes I've thought are pretty scrappy, and what I've done to try to improve it is the different coloured pen. And more recently, I have started reading through a voice memo app, going to my fieldwork and audio recording it, and then doing an automatic transcription through Dropbox, and then reviewing those notes just to speed up the process. So rather than taking your notes and typing them out, that's one technique that I've started using recently that has, I think, been really beneficial in getting the information done as soon as possible for me. And shout out to my colleagues at QSNTS who showed me that voice memo app. It was in the context of some rep bodies asking for audio recordings. I don't like to audio record interviews. Part of that is the practice that when you used to have to transcribe it yourself, it takes about 5 hours in my experience for every hour of interview. So it was a very laboursome process. I also think it really inhibits people from talking more openly with you, especially if you don't know them well. And it would be only after someone's very comfortable with me that I'd suggest that we might do that. I've done some video recording interviews that I didn't like really doing, that it was on the insistence of the body I was working for that time. But in the context of both of those, the key thing I'd say is the issue of free, prior and informed consent, which I will move on to now, because what we're doing and why we're doing it needs to be understood by us and communicated to the people that we're interviewing. And it's also something that you've got to grapple with. It's in native title. If you're engaged as an expert anthropologist, is that, for instance, the Code of Ethics for AAS is about communicating that okay, what am I trying to say? Rather than just read it out, is that people need to understand what's going to happen with the materials they give you, and they need to engage in that process on that understanding. And there are levels of confidentiality you might be able to offer, but there's also what you can't offer. And you have to say, there's the potential that these materials get subpoenaed and that they do get exposed in court if it goes to court. And that needs to be understood. And that's one of the key ways I approach it, in terms of trying to be really clear to people about what will happen with the information they give you. Kingsley Palmer's book on native title anthropology, it's Australian Native Title Anthropology, Strategies, Practice, the Law and the State, 2018, and it's available online. One of the things he says is to deal with this tension between the ethics how we approach fieldwork and the requirements of the federal court, is that communication needs to be made. So I just want to remind us of that. The other thing I think is really important is the implication on the discoverability if it goes to litigation, obviously. And there are a number of anthropologists I know whose field notes have been subpoenaed when a matter goes to litigation. Katie Glaskin's written about this in her book Cross Currents. I've also seen I can't remember the exact case number, but one of the Kimberley cases, Tony Redmond was involved in. And this was raised by the state, where he'd written a comment in his field notes about the violence of colonisation and the massacres and so on. And then they used that matter to attack his standing as an expert witness, saying he was an advocate and so on. As it was, he addressed the matter and the court accepted his discussion on that. But that goes to some of what Craig's saying is about what you put in your field notes is what other people will draw out of it as well. And not always with the interests of your informants in mind. Yes, I think I touched on this before about the context of what is described in the field notes. So not just what people say, but the context it's occurring in. And it's good to, so you note down those patterns. The other thing I do, especially in heritage surveys, is I'll write down who's travelling in what vehicles and what order vehicles visit sites, who goes ahead to the site. And these are the things you can reflect on both, in native title practice and also in the heritage, is what it reveals about systems of authority and what it reveals about the relationships between people. The other thing I think it's worth noting is both the court and a number of state governments in their guidelines emphasise about the importance of the information from Aboriginal people, from the claimants themselves. Now, I do question how much this is said and how much the practice actually reflects that, but that's probably another issue. But what that means is those kind of verbatim statements that people might make to you that you record in the course of fieldwork can actually be really useful demonstrations of something that you're seeking to explain in a connection report. So this is an example of a report that was involved in. And the context here was that it was a discussion about access to country and resources and how acknowledgement of traditional owners was made, and the system of implicit permissions that operated and continued to operate in the context of this desert group. And so this one, Mr. L describes how people in the old days, when they'd visit country, they had to hunt for the owners and give them boomerangs and spears in a practice known as Yinnerly, and which was a formalised exchange and payment system between owners and non-owners. And that wasn't a direct quote. In that context, I put it in that way, but then there's other actual quotes. So Mr. B commented that hunting is free, but to cut spears, you've got to ask. So these were the uses of sort of the fieldwork evidence to demonstrate an argument about the recognition of ownership by others. However, the views of native title claimants are not always consistent with the views of the early ethnographers, and they're not always consistent with each other. Many of us know where there's conflict within groups and between them. So the information from native title claimants still requires analysis and review. And at a presentation then, I think it was 2010, from a workshop, there's a publication that includes this material from Lee Sackett, and he talked about an example of a connection report he'd reviewed where the researcher presented the group as having a system of matrilineal descent as the primary means by which native title rights and interests were transmitted, and that it was presented that it had always been that, despite the historical ethnography not reflecting that. And so the context is that we've got to be much more than a conduit for the information from claimants. So while information from claimants is an important aspect, the context around why they might say something, or some factions of claim groups might say something that is not matched by ethnographic analysis, is itself something we've got to analyse. And that is the end. So I'll leave you with that thought, is field work, field notes are an important aspect of what we do. What claimants say is an important aspect of informing a native title research, but those statements themselves also need analysis and put in context. So thank you.